We're going to start back answering one that was submitted previously. It was a two-parter about head coverings in 1 Corinthians 11 and also women speaking in church from 1 Corinthians 14. Last week, if you were here, you may recall Dayton gave us some really good information about women speaking from the second part of that question. But I think Bobby's going to address, because he was sick last week, wasn't able to be here, he's going to address the head coverings. And let me just do this. Let me read to you some of the questions we've got for future reference. The next question we'll address, and I'm just going to read them to you the way we've been given them. Trying to convert a non-Christian, John 3:3 says baptism is a must to be saved, yet Romans 10:9-12 says that just asking Jesus to save you will do the same as baptism. You will be saved, quote unquote. The thief on the cross, the same thing. These are huge issues when studying with non-Church of Christ people, what to say. So that's another question coming. After that is are all sins equal in God's eyes? And then how long is a child safe before they become a Christian? They may know the steps to baptism and understand the meaning to each step, but they aren't truly convicted yet. And next question is, please explain submission of wives. Please explain a husband's role as a head. Number 6, is it okay to clap during a worship service? And the last one we've got that's been submitted is, what about Acts 8:37 and Mark 16:16 being questioned as whether or not they should be in the Bible? So you see, we've got some pretty good questions coming up. So if you're not satisfied with Bobby's answer this morning on head coverings, just wait for another question. You'll probably get one you like. All right, enough of this. Bobby, talk to us about 1 Corinthians 11.
First Corinthians 11 is where we'll be looking for this in the head coverings. I know Dayton covered part of it last week, but it's still all kind of connected because it runs in that same chapter on a woman's role in public worship, and along with the head coverings and these aspects of it. There's been a lot of controversy in the past, especially of whether or not a woman should have her head covered when she's at church, or whether or not when she's praying, whether she has to cover her hair. Some places used a little doily kind of thing, and there's all kinds of deals going on. But when we look at chapter 11, we have to look at it like we do on every scripture, and that's in the context that it's given. And the covering on a woman's head was considered at that time some sort of a veil. Okay, we think of veils as Fatima and the seven, and the what is it? Seven veils. Okay, we think about that. We think about a veil being one of these things that covers from the nose over, or a bridal veil that covers the whole face. In their particular situations, it was a head covering more like a hoodie, where they would throw this up. And they still, in the Middle East, some certain places where they're Muslim, for instance, will wear these types of head coverings. So this was what Paul was looking at. But in chapter 11, he wasn't really going after how you're going to sit in the church building today. Okay, what he was looking at was the order and the headship and the authority given to men and given to women. This was the whole context of that chapter. So if we pull out something that says, oh, well, now we got to put something on our head, I think we're kind of wandering away from what Paul was intending in that chapter. The key verse is the third verse of chapter 11, where Paul says, but I want you to know. In other words, let him who has ears hear. That's what Jesus would have said. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. This is what he's driving at through this whole section. God the Father, then God the Son, man or husband, if you want to use that too, you can do that. Woman or wife, either one of those. That's the That's the order that God set up from the very, very beginning in the Garden of Eden, where he made man first. He made man in the image of God, and he made the woman the helpmate, or the soulmate, if you would, to the man. We also need to look historically at Corinth at this time, because Corinth at this time was one of the most important cities, if not the most important city in Greece. And it was a pagan society that Paul was writing to. This church that he had established on the second journey is right in the middle of this idolatry and things going on. In fact, they said there was a temple and shrine almost everywhere. It's kind of, if you go to Montreal, they'll tell you that there's a cathedral. It's called the City of 1,000 Churches because there's so many cathedrals. And this was the same way Corinth was. They had so many temples and they had so many shrines, and their biggest god was Aphrodite, or Aphrodite, however you want to pronounce that, who was the goddess of love. So this church is sitting right in the middle of this, and they're having a problem. And the house of Chloe, I don't know if that was a lady or if that was the last name, had sent a letter to Paul and said, hey, we're having a lot of problems. Well, so the first 7 chapters, he kind of goes in and answers those problems. And then he goes on from chapter 7 to the rest of the book, that here he's explaining to them the hierarchy that we should be following. And this is what he gets into in this thing. So I want to really push the hierarchy part of it, because I think that's what Paul is driving for. When he mentions the veil, in that society, the veil meant one of 2 things. It was either shame, yet you veiled yourself because you didn't want to be seen, or it was subjection. One of those 2 things. In the Middle East, like I said, it's still done that way for the ladies. They cover their head to show subjection to their husbands, and primarily. There's several views on the text, unfortunately, when nobody can agree on everything. But they normally wore this hair covering, and their hair was longer than their husbands by design. I went and looked up hair growth, believe it or not, just to see what it was like, and women's hair naturally grows longer than men's, which I thought was kind of interesting. You never see a man with the hair all the way down to their ankles, but you can see women that grow their hair to their ankles. And this is just part of it. He went through the whole thing about how often it changes and how it goes into dormancy and then it falls out for us guys. And women are luckier there that it doesn't do that, because it's part of their glory, according to, I think it's verse 15 in there. But anyway, let's go back to the chasing a rabbit here for a minute. The views on the text are usually, number 1, doesn't apply today at all. You don't even, just ignore it, forget it, shouldn't even be in there. The second is to be the hair being the head covering. Some translations mentions that as the hair is the covering for the ladies. And the third would be the real head covering applicable today, with basic subviews. It's divided, said it should be by women in church services only, or every time they pray and prophesy. Okay, now, and the prophecy kind of gets us stirred up in today's society as well. Prophecy was not what we think normally of a prophet being someone that predicts the future. And in the case of biblical, it was not. It was more of a encouragement, exhortation, comfort. That was the things that prophets did in this time. The no applicability, that's a hard word for me to say. No applicability is easy to dismiss because it's based on the meaning of traditions. And traditions were the pattern of teaching that Paul had given to them, meaning doctrinal commitment. So he's saying, is this doctrine? And you see, he goes later at the end of the chapter and says, there's no scripture for this. There's no, churches are not practicing certain things that you may be practicing, and that's okay. In this case, he was just covering the divine order. This is what he wanted, with the head coverings being the hair. Okay, and again, we go back to the custom of the day and the custom of today. The hair in the verse 15 is the woman's glory. If it meant shame or subjection in that time, how could it be glory and shame? Or how could it be glory and subjection? You see? So we go on, and it said it's part of that order. And if it was just the hair, just consider the hair. Okay, a woman has to have this on her head. That's her head covering. If that was the case, then we have to go back where Paul told the men that their head should be uncovered, so you couldn't serve if you weren't bald or shaved. So think about that, all us guys up there being bald-headed and shining in the dark. I said verse 10, it's not verse 15, excuse me. It's her glory. Is a woman, is it whenever a woman is in the church service, or whenever a woman prays or prophesies publicly? Now, they had prophets. We know that. We had prophetesses. Is that the way you say that? I'm not sure. Lady prophets. How's that? That's better. They had that. We see it in the Old Testament. We have Miriam and Deborah. In the New Testament, we had Anna. Priscilla was a teacher, comforter, exhorter. So they had that, and they had gifts given to them by God. Now, what they were doing with those gifts, I think it was the problem that they were addressing here, that these ladies were trying to basically step up in a place where the men were supposed to be. And this was what Paul was referring to. He says, we've got an order. There's if you want to call it a pecking order, you used to call it, where you have God, the Son, man, and woman. And it's okay. They all have their places, and it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. He was instructing them to remind them of God's hierarchy. And today we say, well, does that mean, he said, well, a woman's got to be silent in church. I think Dayton covered that last week. And we're looking at things that were socially customary. Today, head coverings don't mean subjection. A woman puts on a hat or whatever. It doesn't show a subjection to her husband. Some things do that we do. We have wedding rings that show subjection. The way they act and behave, that's subjection to your husband. This is what Paul was saying. And it's in their society to show that submission was the veils. Some of the pagan prophetesses, the lady prophets that were there in that city. Again, we got to remember in Corinth, in this pagan city, and those prophetesses would come out with their head not only uncovered, but they would mess up their hair and it'd be all scattered everywhere, and to attract the attention of what they were doing. And Paul was saying, we don't want that. Your hair is your glory. Why would you be messing it up and showing it out in that aspect? So the women that were wearing their hair coverings were showing submission. The women who were not were showing not submissive. One other thing in there before I quit, because it was in the first section of the questions that I got, was what about the angels that were mentioned in verse 10? And this is one that was really a stumper because nobody seems to know for sure. Scholars argue back and forth. I certainly can't answer, 100%, but I can give you some aspects, and that's some think they were good angels. These were the angels that were to minister to the saints, mentioned in Hebrews and 1 Peter. Some believe it was to shield them from evil angels because she was the weaker vessel and was tempted and caused the fall. Or not caused, because Adam had part in that too. Some think it would be spies or false teachers who would try to undermine the submission which God placed on women, and that could be today. You know, we have people that would be saying, well, you've got to have the head covers, otherwise you're out of line. It says that, that you have to do this. And Paul said, no. He said, I'm just talking about God's hierarchy. Though men and women are different, the distinction between them must be maintained in church and in family, because that's the way God set things up. Man was created in the image of God. Woman was created from man. Even though man is imperfect, he was given dominion, if you remember, in the Garden of Eden, over everything. And Eve came along after that, which meant that the man had the dominion. Not, it wasn't a dictatorship. It wasn't, anything of that nature. He wasn't to take over and say, look at me, I'm God on earth. It wasn't what he intended on doing. But the man was subjected to God, and the woman was subjected to man. And it was just really that simple when you get down to it. God designed a role for men and women to be followed in both church and in worship. Again, I think Dayton covered that last week so I won't go back into the worship part of it, but he set it up that way. Also, in addition to what Paul said here about the head covering, he also gave some other instructions when he was talking to Timothy about a woman dressing appropriately and professing godliness with good works. These are ways that we show things without having our head covered. Not to be disruptive, in worship service. Not to teach or usurp authority of a man, and I think that's in public worship. And, I'm sorry? General spirit, yes. Nowhere in the New Testament do we find where a woman is leading the services, even though they were prophetesses. So the order has been so from the beginning. Adam first, then Eve was formed from Adam. She was deceived, and it continues in the faith and love and holiness and self-control. These are the things that cover a woman. Doesn't mean that a woman is a dummy. I know I've heard that before. Well, if I'm a subjection, I'm just getting walked on. Well, that's not the role of the man. If the woman's being walked on, he's out of line. So, and that's another subject maybe later we can tackle. So she can sing, pray, take part in the Lord's Supper, but they have an active role to play in God's hierarchy and still remaining in subjection to men. They're every bit the equal spiritually. There's not a woman that gets any less salvation than a man. They are disciples of Christ and obedient to God. The scripture that sends us out, Mark 16:16, to go into all the world, preach the gospel, that's for all disciples, and women are disciples just like men. Neither Jew nor Greek, So the women show their submission to God's authority by being submissive to the man's authority, not by hair, not by a veil, but by their good works. And I think I'm finished. Any questions or comments? I guess I scared you all, huh?
I think it's a good idea. I don't know if Marty brought it out the other day or not, but it's not necessarily wrong for a woman to speak up in class, because us as men have learned things from what women say sometimes in class, because
Sure.
we never thought about it.
That's why I said spiritually, women are as equal as men. It's in the worship service where he says, okay, this is the way it's going to be set up. If you're going to suddenly jump up and take over the class, then she's going to be kind of out of line. But as far as, and that's for actually probably men too, if you had someone up there teaching and some guy goes off on a rant and just continues, won't hush, I remember a few years ago, one of our elders was in a class and mentioned the Muslims and said something about Muslims, and this lady went off and just kept going and going and going, and she wouldn't quit. And I thought he handled it well. He took it better than I would have, because I said, okay, it's enough. Sit down. We heard your point. But he handled it well, and the lady got her say in, but it kind of disrupted the whole idea of the class from that point on. And I think this is what he's warning about here, was, taking over kind of, and, just rushing into it and giving no one else a chance. It's supposed to be the handle from God. Now, can they teach? Absolutely, they can teach. We have that with Priscilla and Aquila, where they went and got the guy that was teaching in error, pulled him off to the side, not in the public worship service where he was teaching, but they pulled him off to the side and then taught him more proper, as the scriptures say. So, anybody got anything else? Yes.
We're in New Mexico. We went to a little church there, and it later got to be known as the Church of Christ with the Episcopalian meaning. But anyway, when the song leader would get up and lead singing, then this woman would stand on the other side and lead singing. She said she was a deaconess. That just never sat well with me.
The women that we see that are prophetesses, though, in the scripture, were giving something that was, the Holy Spirit was given to them to do these things. And unless, for me personally, unless the woman or the man, for that matter, claims to be inspired from the Holy Spirit, he's going to have to come up with a little more proof than just to tell me that's what it is. He's going to have to do something. Raise a dead guy. Okay, I'll follow you. If you raise somebody who's been dead for 3 days like the Lord did, well, yeah, okay. I think there's something to it. But so many people, and especially today with the TV and everything, claim so many miraculous gifts that it almost makes a mockery of those spiritual gifts. And so a lot of people can claim that. Now, I believe that ministers have a calling, that it's something that this calling says, I got to do it. I can't stick back and not do it anymore. Women can have callings just as well, but they are regulated by God's hierarchy in public worship. Now, in private worship, there's a whole different story. If you're at home and you want, the husband says to the wife, if you go ahead and lead a prayer, there's nothing wrong with that. She can do that. He's given her the authority. Same way in the church, there's certain things that we can give authority to women for, that the men can release that authority to the ladies, and that's fine. And God released some of his authority to the man. That's where you give him the dominion over everything. So I'm running into Steve's time, but got anything else before I quit now that I've got you?
These people said that James and I just weren't spiritual enough, is why we didn't care for it.
Yes.
Like, okay.
I've heard that that's why you're not getting healed. You weren't spiritual enough, those kinds of things. So, okay, Steve, are you next, I believe? Huh? Okay.
Same subject, my study on the head covering. To me, 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16 is on head covering, and pretty much that alone. And Paul does say that, as Bob has said, that of the order of creation, there's no doubt. But in verse 2, Paul talks about, now I commend you because you remember me and everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. Those traditions had to do with head covering, because that's what this section is about, is head covering. Verse 3 talks about the divine orders Bob has covered. Paul went back to Genesis 2 and talked about God Christ, man, and woman. And so he goes back to that order. But, excuse me, Paul's instructions are based on Genesis 2. Man should not cover his head. We'll go to verses 8 and 9. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And he's saying this because man should not cover his head, because there's a distinction between man and woman at that time in that culture and that society. And so Paul said he shouldn't cover his head. And woman should cover her head because she is the glory of man at that culture and at that time. And in verse 7 and 15, Paul said that, verse 7, he said that for man ought not to cover his head, he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. And then in verse 15, he said, but if a woman has long hair, it is to her glory, for her hair was given to her for a covering. At that time and in that culture, long hair for a woman was for her glory, and it was a covering for her. Culture dictates the distinction between male and female. Our culture is different than their culture in the sense that women don't cover their head out in public. In America, they don't. The veil, from my studies, the veil it was part of the robe that she wore. You'd take part of it and put it over here like a woman's shawl. So it wasn't anything special, but they covered, Paul said they covered their head out in public, not at home. And so, and the whole passage is strewn with the culture of the day. Look at verse 4 and 5. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. In that culture, man didn't cover his head out in public. When he worshiped, he didn't cover it. But 5, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. But in that culture, out in public, a woman covered her hair with her part of her robe. She had a covering. And that's the way it was in that time. And verse 4 and 5, and it's talking about honor and shame, verse 4 and 5. It's talking about, it's a shame, it's a disgrace. Verse 10, that is why a wife ought to be have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels, a sign of authority, a sign of the distinction between male and female in the first century Jewish society. That was a sign of distinction, wearing the covering out in public. That was the order was set at creation by God, as Bob said. But in the Jewish society, there was distinctions. There's distinctions today, and I started trying to think of them. There's not near as many in our society in America, and they're becoming less, but that's another subject, isn't it? But in that day, that was a definite distinction of the woman's attire and how she dressed. Verses 13 through 15, again, talks about, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? In that day, he's saying, judge for yourself. Her head has to be covered. 14, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him? Nature itself, nature of that day and time. All cultures think it's natural the way we dress. Doubt me? Isn't it natural the way you and I are dressed right now? Have somebody come in here with a robe and a burqa. Is that natural? It's not natural, and you know it. When somebody dresses completely different than us, it's not natural, and I think that's what he's saying here. Does not nature tell you itself, or what is acceptable in that time, that a man wears long hair is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it isn't. And last of all, of course, you get down to verse 16. And if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no other such practice, nor do the churches at that time, the churches that Paul talked about, that goes back to verse 2, of the traditions that he taught about covering. Then when you get to the distinction of male and female is absolute. There's no problem with the distinction of male and female. But how that distinction is expressed in each society would be a little bit different. There is the distinction, but it's maybe shown in different ways in different societies. So, if you look at this whole section through verse 16 as head covering, because in my opinion, that's what it's talking about. It's simply head covering. And in Paul's day, they showed the distinction this way, that a woman would pray out in public. As I was studying this, Everett Ferguson, who is a noted scholar Christian scholar, he said that, in public worship, the woman would cover her head. But in the home, if the church was when a woman was in her home, her own home, she didn't cover her head. She didn't have to cover her head in her home. So what would happen if the church met in the home? Then might one say, well, might a woman say, I don't need to cover my head because I'm in my home? But Paul was saying, yes, but in other words, if it's a church, the church as a symbol, then the distinctions and the traditions would apply. Where they wouldn't, like Bob said, a woman, wife praying, it wouldn't hold true. But if the church was there, then that's a whole different situation. So as I and I may be wrong, but as I look at this, that it's about the traditions of those days, and that's why today no one in here's ladies covering their head, because we don't have the same traditions. We don't have the same dress attire that they did back then. But we do have God-given distinctions between male and female. And he mentioned, in Deuteronomy 22:5, God said that it's an abomination, which he uses for other things, an abomination if a man was to wear a woman's clothing or vice versa. John?
Seems, you said nowadays most women don't wear head cover. Seems Easter, a lot of women dress up and wear hats, bonnets, whatever you want to call it, during worship or whatever, and that seems to be the only day, except maybe Mother's Day. Is that acceptable, not acceptable?
Well, of course, sure.
don't ask me, I don't know.
It's just a special occasion and a special time to wear a special time. Sometimes men wear tuxedos. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that at all. PJ? Pardon?
It's just fashion.
What's fashion?
Wearing
Oh, and today, all right, right. Today, hats are fashion. They are not shame and dishonor. They're not talking about that in our society, in our worship. They're not a what? They're not a symbol of authority, like Bob mentioned the wedding ring. Will?
In reference to this culture, we remove our hats for certain periods of time. We remove our hat when we stand for the national anthem as a sign of respect, not necessarily because it's scriptural and we have to, but I was taught when we come into worship, we remove our hats because it's a sign of respect in this culture.
Very good thought. That's true. That's one of our cultural things that a man, he said a man, would remove a hat when they come into a home. It used to be that way, in a home. But today, we don't do that so much, but we still do it when we assemble as a matter of respect and honor that we are submitting, basically putting God first. That may be changing too. You see that a little bit. There's what? Somebody?
Steve,
Yes.
the thing about it is, him bringing up the subject of the hat, if someone comes to my home, you don't wear your hat in my house.
That's the way my great aunt, she told you to get it off or she'd take
When
it off.
I see men going into a restaurant and sitting down eating, to me, that's disrespectful. You take your hat off when you're at the table. You know, it's just respect. You know, and I think that in today's society, we have lost our respect and our dignity and our morals. And the more we just lean toward everybody else to do it, we accept it.
Well, yeah, you make an excellent point. I agree with it. I'm guilty. I was raised on my great aunt, and like I said, you did not wear your hat in her house. You just didn't do it. I've seen her take a hat off of a man, a grown man, when I was a kid, and throw it. But it did. You know, it had a sign. We had serious things about being respectful to law and order and all that. But like I said, that's another thing. And our they're breaking down our distinctions. The greatest threat to the church is too much assimilating culture into the church. And that's another subject. Did you want to speak? Any other questions for me?
Daniel said, culture changes.
Yes.
Culture in America changes.
Yes.
It is the hat thing is not the culture it once was.
Right.
The culture has changed by many. I don't think that's necessarily evil or good. I don't think it's bad or good. It's just different. Okay? A lot of men wear hats in different places. Some of them wear them at the dining table and work at they go to a restaurant and they put their hats on. That's a cultural thing.
Yeah, and I brought that up when Paul said it's a shame for a woman to go out in public without her head being covered. Well, that does not apply to us today in America. It just doesn't. I give you 2 minutes, 1 minute. Time's up.
I just want to make one point I think that's vital in this. It's been stumbled around by 2 or 3 here already, so the key verse in 1 Corinthians 11 is verse 16, when Paul summarized and made the statement that we have no such custom. And he also mentioned another key word that needs to be noted. If anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. This word custom has back in its root meaning the idea of friendship. It's something that you do, and you do it together, and you enjoy one another, and that's all we've been talking here about culture. But Paul labeled this simply as a custom. He did not label it as a law. And we need to make a distinction. Now, if you want to make a law about someone at your table with a hat on, you will overstep what Paul's talking about. If we lay down a law where it is a custom, let me give you a parallel now. In Jude verse 3, it makes the statement, contend earnestly for the faith. Now there is a contending environment, and it's where law does exist. But if it is only a custom, then Paul says we don't have contentions about those. And that'll help us a lot. There's some people that tend to take the putting of a hat on in the service as for a woman or a covering is a law. No, it isn't. Never was. It just related to custom. For example, turn to John 18 and verse 39. You have the word custom again used, and that might help us make the right application in 1 Corinthians 11. This is when Jesus was on trial, and Pilate said to the people, "But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. And then, do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" You've got a custom. That wasn't a Roman law. It wasn't God's law. It was a custom. And you might do it or you might not do it, and it be appropriate. So watch about contending for customs. That's just a trend. The word itself, here are some definitions. The root idea is friendship or fellowship, being or becoming accustomed. That's what we generally do. It also means it's a want. Some people want it. Well, if they do, let them do it. It's not a law one way or the other. It's a want, a usage, a custom. Or a custom of being used to. That's the way we generally do it. That's a custom. But that's not like whether one will need to be baptized to be saved or not. Now we're getting into law. And those you contend earnestly for the faith. But if anyone is going to be contentious about a custom, you better watch. Johnny, I think, touched on that point. You can easily go too far if you try to take a custom and bind it on someone else. For example, what if the man or the woman didn't wear a covering, and someone else insisted that they ought to wear a covering. Be careful. You're trying to take covering as a law, and you'll abuse your relationship with that person and may never reach them. And so watch between custom and law. Contend for the law. We don't have customs as laws. I think I hear people stirring. Must be a